Today we are diving into the world of Spring configuration, but before we jump in, let's talk about a cool feature that makes Spring Boot development super convenient and, in my opinion, magical. And that cool feature is auto configuration. So Spring Boot comes with a lot of auto configuration policies, and we can see that when we add dependencies to our project, like when we add Spring Boot Starter Web to our application, then it comes with an embedded Tomcat server, and when we run our application, then the embedded Tomcat server start to listen on port 8080, right? So that is very convenient for us. We didn't need to configure anything regarding the port. Spring Boot automatically configuring that for us. But what if we want to change the port? What if we are running two separate applications from the same machine? Then we have to change our port because two applications cannot run on the same port on the same host. So in that case, we have to change the port. And same goes for Spring Data JPA. When we add Spring Data JPA to our application, then all the configuration for database connection is automatically configured to our application. We just need to provide the username and password. So that brings us to the main topic of this video, which is Spring configurations. So how we can override the auto configuration provided by Spring Boot. In order to do that, we have a file under our resource folder called application.properties or application.yml. Both is for same purpose. The syntax for the file is just different. Okay, so I'm continuing with application.properties file, which is a key value format with equal sign, where the first part is the key and then equal sign and the value. Let's say we want to host our application to port 8081. Then what we have to do is we have to set the port for servlet container to 8081. We can do that by setting server.port to 8081. So now if we run our application once again, then our application is listening to 8081. Now let's see how the application.yml file would look like if we want to follow the YML syntax. So I'm renaming the file to application.yml. This is the format for YML. Actually, Spring Boot support a lot of configuration, which we can learn from the official documentation of Spring Boot here. Here we can have categorized properties value, like if we want to have web properties, then this is for GraphQL. If we want to have server properties, then server.address, different type of properties here. This is the server.port, which we are using for our example. Okay, so this application.yml file support two kind of properties. One is which I have just shown, predefined in the Spring documentation. Another one is our custom value. If we want to have some value which we want to have configurable in our application, then we can put that in our YML file. Like we want to have a property called, we can access this value in our application with annotation called property. Okay, so this YML file or properties file also support different type of profiles. Like I can create a separate YML file in the format of application hyphen the name of our profile .yml or properties, then that will be on the profile which we can set from our main application.yml file. So Spring Boot will first look into the application.yml or application.properties file. So if I want to use a separate profile, then I can use this one, spring.profiles.active equal to, let's say, local. Then I have to have a configuration file called application-local.yml, and then I can bring all my configuration from this to this local file. And for our testing, if we put here 8088 and run our server again, then we'll see that our application is running on port 8088. Another way we can access our custom property to our code is writing configuration class. So let's say we have two different value here, my custom value, my custom code, which is Monir. For this we can create a class, and inside the class we can put a annotation called configuration properties, and inside that configuration properties we just have to put my.custom, and it will read all the sub value under that prefix. All the value will be assigned to the appropriate variable defined in the configuration class. So those are different ways we can access value from our YAML file. I would like to encourage you to experiment with properties and explore further resource which is available on Spring Boot documentation. Today we'll understand what is filtering in Spring Boot, what are some common use cases for filtering, and how we can achieve filtering in our Spring Boot application. So let's dive in. Filtering is a component in Spring Boot which intercepts and processes all the incoming requests and also the outgoing responses. So a filter in Spring Boot application sits between a client and a resource or a controller. So when a request is made by a client, with filtering we can achieve logging of the request, we can check authorization and permit or reject the request, we can modify the request headers, we can modify the request body, and many more. So filter provides us the benefits, and now let's see how we can achieve this kind of filtering in our Spring Boot application. So here we have a REST controller which serving a list of string actually. Now we want to have filtering in our Spring Boot application. Here we have a package called config. Inside that config package I'll be creating my filtering. So let's say I want to log all the requests and response with a filter. So I'm creating a filter called logging filter. So this logging filter have to implement the filter interface which comes from servlet. This is the filter we want to implement. This comes from jakarta.servlet. So we have to implement the method in that interface, and there are three methods. One is init and destroy and doFilter. Init and destroy, as the name says, for initialization and destroying, and another method is doFilter, which is mandatory to implement. In this method we have three parameters. One is servlet request, another one is servlet response, and the last one is filter chain. So we have to call the filter chains doFilter method once again, because this will pass the request to the resource or controller or to another filter. Okay, so this is mandatory to call. We'll call filter chain dot doFilter, and the parameter is servlet request and servlet response. So this is one way we can implement our filtering, but in order for Spring to have this filter in its container, we need to annotate this filter with add component annotation. Okay, now every time a request comes, the code we put before this filter chain doFilter method will be executed before the request is processed from the controller, and everything we put after the doFilter method will be executed after the request is processed and response is generated from the controller. This is one way to implement the filter.
if a controller or resource dispatch the request internally to another controller, then this filter can be executed one more time. So if we want to make sure that a filter get called only once in a HTTP request, we can extend the OncePerRequestFilter class instead. In that case, we have to implement another method called doFilterInternal, which is pretty much same. It has 3 parameters. One is request, one is response, and other one is filter chain. And anything we write before this doFilter method will be executed before the request is processed from the controller, and anything we write after this doFilter will be executed after the response is generated. Okay, so this is one way. Now another way is to use filter registration bin. Let's say we want to have our filter with filter registration bin. In that case, we have to implement our filter, but we do not want to make this a component, but instead we want to create another class as Spring configuration. Let's name the class filter bin config, and inside that class we have to implement a method which returns a filter registration bin of the type of filter, and we have to make the class a Spring configuration like this, and implement a method which returns filter registration bin of the type of our required filter. So here we want to have logging filter, and we are returning a filter registration bin of type logging filter, and inside that method which is returning a bin, we can set some additional parameter like URL patterns and the order. The URL pattern means that any URL that matches this pattern will go through this request filter before the request is passed to the controller or resource. And we can also set the order here with a setter method, and if a request matches with this pattern, then the code before this method will be executed before the request is passed to the controller, and the code after this method will be executed after the response is generated. These are the ways we can implement filtering in our Spring Boot application. I hope